Hello guys, time for our monthly tradition, which is every month on this channel, tips and tricks about Laravel from Twitter. This month I've gathered and collected and curated around a dozen of tips, so without further ado, rapid fire, let's go. Tip number 1 comes from Ash Allen. Did you know that there's a method, number file size? So for example, if you want to display the number in kilobytes or megabytes or something like that, there's number file size with different parameters. So you can just specify the bytes, and by the way, did you know that you can represent the number with underscore? And also you may define the precision if you want to show megabytes with some digits after the dot. Here's the same image in the zoomed in version so you would see more clearly. The next tip comes from Harris, and it's about HTTP calls which you can record, so to speak. So for example, in your testing, instead of doing HTTP fake to fake the requests, if you want to debug the real requests, you can record them kind of upfront and then do something like this. There's a tutorial with this tweet by the same Harris, and he provides a real-world example. So you start the recording, you perform some kind of API call, and then do something else, and then sometime later you can launch HTTP recorded and then make some check and make some debugging and log something. Personally, I've never used it. I didn't even know about such feature, but seems useful in some cases. And by the way, in the description below, I will put the links to all those tweets so you can read them with the comments yourself. The next tip comes from Laracast, or from Newton Job, who now works at Laracast, and this is about 500 error on the API. So if you have a public API, you never know who would consume it and how. And a pretty typical mistake by developers is to not accept application JSON. This is a typical mistake even for your own APIs while working with Postman. I've noticed that in my own comments on YouTube and in courses. So with this piece of code, the exception would be overridden with actually rendering JSON instead of throwing 500 error. Again, the same image in the zoomed in version so you would see more clearly. The next tip comes from Ash Allen again. He's repeating guest in this video, and in general you probably notice the same people month after month tweeting, so I suggest to follow them personally to get those tips first before I do a monthly video. So when you run route list, you may specify only vendor, for example, and that would list only the routes from the packages. So this is the result, a bit blurry, maybe I should zoom it even more. In this case, you see routes from Ignition and from package by Ash himself. There's also an opposite key, so if you provide route list except vendor, it would show only your app routes, excluding the vendor routes. If you don't provide any key, then it shows both. The next tip comes from Aniket, also regular guest of this monthly series. So if you see the data with Faker, by default the Faker locale is English for US, but when seeding the data with different Faker locale, let me zoom in. If you provide app Faker locale, for example, India, the result for names, phone numbers, and addresses may be drastically different. So if you want to provide more local and more cultural fit, so to speak, results for testing for your clients, just change the locale of Faker. The next tip comes from Hamed, and it's not even Laravel tip. Laravel was the last step of a series of how to implement calculating the distance with various languages. So first Hamed implemented it in PHP, and this is called Haversin formula, and this was the original inspiration. It's about proximity to target location, and there's a mathematical formula for that, so latitude and longitude and second latitude and longitude, and this is how it would look in PHP, so distance. And now we get back to the original Laravel Eloquent query, almost the same thing, but with scope for Eloquent model, like this. This Haversin becomes a condition which you put inside of raw query. And the goal for this Eloquent scope is not to calculate the distance, but find nearby drivers according to that distance. The next tip comes from Punyapal here, and this is about a method called str_swap. And this is an example from Laravel docs: swap tacos with burritos and great with fantastic. And the documentation says that it's using PHP function strtr under the hood, but also I want to point Paul's comment down below that you may probably use multiple things with str replace as well. I'm not sure if those two are absolutely identical, so if you know the answer, put it in the comments below. But this is quite a typical thing, that you may use PHP function, or you may use another PHP function for strings or arrays, or there are helpers in Laravel. And a typical question with that, are Laravel helpers slower because they use framework instead of native functions? And sometimes, theoretically, yes, they are slower by definition because they come through layers, but in real applications for just string manipulation, you wouldn't feel that slowness unless you're running like billions of operations. And Laravel helpers often provide a better syntax for readability. Again, it's a personal preference and depends on the function, and str swap is just one example of that. The next tip comes from Zacharias here, and this is kind of a reminder. What is multi-tenancy in general? This is one of the hottest topics ever in Laravel or in any framework, how to build multi-tenant applications. And the thing is that definition of multi-tenancy and tenant in general may be very complex with multiple databases, teams, and stuff like that, or it could be just a field in the database table, like team ID or a user ID. User may be tenant as well. Tenant doesn't necessarily have to be a team or a company. So in this case, what Zacharias is suggesting for simple cases, just add team ID field to whatever table you're working with, then have current team ID for each user, and then add scope to each model where you want to use that multi-tenancy. And then inside of that model, within scope, when saving the data, it would set the team ID, and when querying the data, it would query by that team ID. This is kind of the most simple implementation of multi-tenancy for simple cases. The next tip comes from Aniket again, repeating in the same video. It's about testing the responses. If you, for example, encounter some bugs, so response isn't as expected, and then you can dump the response in many other ways, not just DD. You can dump or DD, and which part do you want to dump? The body, the JSON, the headers, whatever you want. And DD methods will stop right away after dumping, and dump will just, dump to the terminal and then proceed with other tests. The next tip comes from Jordan, and this is an example how you can use PHP enums with route binding in Laravel. Again, let's take a look at the zoomed in version. So there's the enum, and then in your route, you may provide the enum as a parameter. It doesn't have to be eloquent model for route model binding. There's also route enum binding. And what it does, not just forming the route, but also adds the validation. So if there's a value which is not in the enum values, then Laravel would automatically return 404, like in the route model binding with eloquent models. The next tip comes from Aniket, again, third time in this video, but it's so good that I didn't want to miss that. So there's a method called getDirty in Eloquent that contains all the changes for your order like this. Again, let's zoom in. So these would be the contents of order getDirty, if you call that. But did you know there's also one more method, getChanges, that save the changes after the update, after it's saved in the database? So you can get not the full model, but only the fields that were actually changed in the last update operation. Two more tips to go, and this one comes from Osama here. And if you create Artisan commands, you may be interested in the prompts for missing input functionality. Again, let's zoom in, and if your command implements prompts for missing input, here is the input for user. And if someone launches the command with just mail sent, not providing the user, then Artisan command would prompt it like this. And the final tip comes from Gary, not that much about Laravel, but about composer scripts. So if you tend to run a few commands each time on, for example, checking something, you may specify that as array of commands like php stand, php artisan test, something else, and then when you run composer test, it would execute everything inside of that array. And by the way, side note, follow Gary if you're interested in microservices. So many people are asking me to create some content about microservices, but I'm not an expert in that field, and Gary is creating a course about microservices. By the time this video airs, that course is probably already released, and there are a few videos on YouTube, from what I remember, by Gary explaining the fundamentals. So yeah, follow his Twitter and watch his videos on microservices. The final thing in this video, I want to remind you that on Laravel Daily website, we have a free learning roadmap for Laravel developers, which is very detailed, point by point, with links to official Laravel docs, and also on top we have kind of an overview of the ecosystem. What does it mean to be a full stack developer and what are the different paths, with links to our own courses. And as you can see, all courses are Laravel 12, so we updated recently 12 courses to Laravel 12, which is a symbolic number. So I will link that roadmap in the description below, so you may check that out and see for yourself which part is the most relevant to you. That's it for this time, and see you guys in other videos.